We're going to move now to the last talk of the afternoon, which is going to be given by Renata Salecl. So Renata is one of that group of people who've made Ljubljana the sort of Lacanian capital of the world. I mean, one of the little-known things about Ljubljana is I think it's the only European city which still has a statue of Napoleon, which I always think is kind of surreptitiously linked. Or possibly also Ljubljana, I mean, Slovenia in the process of moving from communism abandoned, obviously, the practice of the state privilege of printing Marx and Engels for a while, but still it took a while to move into straightforward pluralism. So I have the feel that while Marx and Engels vanished for a while, the state publishing company must have carried on producing Lacan, so that people kind of coming home from the fields at night would say, well, Magda, what are we going to read this evening? And people would say, I thought we'd have another look at Seminar Oz. Anyway, for whatever obscure reasons, it's turned Ljubljana into an amazing center of intellectual life. Renata herself, we're very pleased to see in London here at the moment, where she is the centennial professor at the LSE, and hopefully kind of studiously rebutting the notion of the third way. She's in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ljubljana, and as you probably know, has published many books, including from Verso, Perversions of Love and Hate, The Spoils of Freedom, Psychoanalysis and Feminism After the Fall of Socialism, and Why Do We Obey Power? Social Control, Ideology, and Ideological Fantasies. With Slavoj Žižek, she edited the book Voice, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome Renata here this evening.
Thanks, Mark, for invitation and for this kind words. I'm sure that if Tony Widler were to live in Ljubljana, he would have had Lacan's seminar on his table near his bed, because Lacan actually was a bestseller in Ljubljana, but I would say that people didn't read him. They just kind of thought that it was cool to buy the books, which of course helped us Lacanians. But I will continue with the kind of gender difference that was established at this conference, which means that men here are speaking about beautiful buildings, about clean products, and about nice bags. Women are using very gruesome images to depict their theoretical points. So those of you who didn't have enough of gruesome image, I want to compete with her and show even more, but this is not. This is just the beginning. Okay, now, so if in my title I say that I'm speaking about anxiety, arts, and war, and of course, war has been widely depicted in the arts, throughout centuries, and even the last wars in the Balkans have already inspired numerous artists. And among the most famous ones are Jenny Holzer, who, with her Lastmer project, was trying to reflect the rapes in the Bosnian War, and basically she was doing the writing on the skin, but also and also you probably all know how Marina Abramovic cleaned a pile of bones at Venice Biennale. Now, even Kosovo War now has been in a way depicted by artists. The famous new British artists produced a drawing book for Kosovo children. I unfortunately don't have a photo of this. Now, in this paper, however, my intention is not to analyze how art depicts today's wars and arts as two different areas in which one can distinguish a common problem which concerns the nature of subjectivity in today's world. I will focus particularly on the problem of anxiety that subjects experience in today's world. Now, since art in depicting the changes that the subjects face in society, I will take examples from art to illuminate my theoretical. Now, one often hears that today we live in an age of anxiety. With the turn of the new millennium, it looks as if scientific research, economic development, military intervention, and especially the power of the new media are less and less under public control, and that all kinds of catastrophes can be. In the last month of the old millennium, we especially experienced this anxiety when we were bombarded with the danger of the millennium bug. Now, while politicians were warning us to prepare ourselves for the possible collapse of computer system and everything with it, it very much looked how in today's society no one is in charge anymore. Now, the fear of possible catastrophe, however, quickly turned into matters when there was no millennium bug. A theory emerged at that point that the whole fuss around millennium bug was created by computer companies so that they will be able to sell more advanced computers. Now, a particular problem of anxiety applies also to various military interventions that we witness in today's societies. Public media often report on the cases of psychological breakdowns of soldiers on the front and on their traumas after the war. Now, throughout the history, these breakdowns were named differently. You remember that after World War I, we were talking about shell shock. Later, after Vietnam War, the term post-traumatic stress disorder became kind of a fashionable term to describe panic attacks, anxiety, nightmares that the soldier often experienced for a long time after the battle. Now, the invention of this term, post-traumatic stress disorder, in a way tried to take guilt away from the soldier, so that his condition is perceived as not being caused by any of his own psychological predispositions, but by purely external circumstances. Now, military psychiatry for decades tries to figure out what incites such breakdowns on the front, and why many people after the war still experience nightmares, panic attacks, depression, and so on. How does a breakdown usually happen? A particular soldier is often able to carry on in combat for considerable time under conditions of extreme danger and discomfort until an event takes place which the soldier's defenses cannot encompass. Now, as one psychiatrist explains, the actual events vary tremendously. There are, different events, for example, like the change in the structure of the group, death of a leader, of a colleague, or just, subtle change in the behavior of the enemy. Now, therefore, for the soldiers, it is crucial that they do not become suddenly cowardly, but rather they experience a special state of anxiety which in a way radically differs from fear when certain event happens. Now, the usual perception is that we fear something that we can see or hear, that's to say something that can be discerned as an object or a situation. Fear in our everyday perception would therefore concern what can be articulated, so that we are, for example, able to say, I have a fear of darkness, or I fear encountering barking dogs. In contrast, we often perceive anxiety as a state of fear which is objectless, which means that we cannot easily say what makes us anxious. Anxiety, therefore, would be an uncomfortable effect which is more horrible than fear precisely because it is unclear what provokes it. Now, such definitions of the difference between anxiety and fear might very well be what we think we experience in our daily lives. However, psychoanalysis gives a more complicated view on their difference. Freud pointed out that anxiety is a state of affect which has been provoked by an excitation. He had two theories of anxiety. One which linked anxiety to an excess of libidinal energy that has not been discharged, and another which takes anxiety as a feeling of an imminent danger to the ego, which pushes the subject into a state of panic. Freud also pointed out that anxiety is linked to a special state of preparedness, so it looks as if the subject defends him or herself against some horror with the help of anxiety. And Freud here uses twice the same example of a train crash. His idea is that some people after a train crash might later develop, kind of panic attacks, nightmares, and so on. And Freud's theory is that these nightmares, for example, in a way, try to recreate a state of anxiety preparedness which did not exist before the train crash. So his idea is that, in a way, anxiety preparedness in some way eliminates the danger of the trauma emerging afterwards. And that nightmares, in a way, somehow try to recreate this preparedness which was lacking. When Jacques Lacan speaks about anxiety, he first introduces the problem of castration and the subject's relation with the other. However, it is not that the subject has some kind of a castration anxiety towards the other. That's to say that he or she takes the other as someone who might take something pressure from him or her. Lacan points out that neurotic does not retreat from castrating other, but from making of his own castration what is lacking to the other. Now, what does this mean? When psychoanalysis claims that the subject undergoes symbolic castration by becoming a speaking being, this must be understood as the fact that the subject per se is empty, nothing by him or herself. All the subject's power comes from the symbolic insignias that he or she temporarily takes on. Here we can take a many times used example in a way of a person, let's say a policeman or a judge or someone who might be a nobody, boring, insignificant, kind of impotent man in his everyday life until he puts on his uniform, his robe, and becomes a person of extreme power. So the subject, therefore, is empty in the meaning of being castrated, powerless by him or herself, and only by occupying a certain place in the symbolic order, he or she temporarily gets power or status. Now, the subject is also always bothered by the fact that the other is inconsistent, that the other is split, not whole. Other here in the meaning of the big other, and also, if you want, the meaning of the others, insignificant others in our life. Which means that we cannot also say what the desire of the other is and how one appears in the eyes of the other, or in the desire of the other. The only thing that can ensure the meaning to the other and, for example, provide an answer to the question of the desire of the other is a signifier. Since such signifier is lacking, on the missing place comes a sign from the subject's own castration. To the lack in the other, the subject can therefore answer only with his or her own lack. And in dealing with his or her own lack, as well as with the lack in the other, the subject encounters anxiety. However, anxiety provoking for the subject is not the lack, but more the absence of the lack. That's to say, the fact that there, where one is supposed to, in a way, observe a lack or encounter a lack, some object is present. Now, here a nice example can be found in today's art. Anish Kapoor, whom you very well know, is an artist who constantly plays with the issue of lack. But what is perturbing with his sculptures, which depict emptiness, is that by observing the holes, one has uncanny feeling that lack is not lack, that there is something inside the holes, emptiness, which takes you in. Equally interesting is his work, Why I Am Pregnant. Now, when you observe this from the side, you can see that there is a bum kind of sticking out of the wall. However, when you observe it from the front, you have an uncanny feeling that there is something on the wall that bothers you, but in a way you cannot discern what it is. Similarly, one has uncanny feelings that there is something, uncanny in the artwork when one observes the holes in Fontana's work, when you, in a way, realize that the holes are, in a way, not empty, but, somehow pictured that there is, kind of color inside, actually shades, various shades of darkness. This creates, in a way, an uncanny feeling on the side of the observer. Now, one of the ways for the subject to deal with his or her anxiety is to create a fantasy. Fantasy is a way for the subject to cover up the lack by creating a scenario, a story that gives him or her consistency. However, fantasy also helps the subject to prevent the emergence of anxiety. That's to say, the emergence of the horrible object at the place of the lack. Now, let me illustrate this point with the example of the Israeli soldier named Ami, who had served both in Yom Kippur and in Lebanon war. Ami had been an avid film goer, and when he went to Yom Kippur war, he felt as if he was going to play a part of the soldier in a war movie. Now, this fantasy sustained him throughout the war. He says, I said to myself, it's not so terrible. It's like a war movie. They are actors and I'm just some soldier. I don't have an important role. Naturally, there are all the weapons that I can see in war movies, helicopters, tanks, there is shooting. But basically, I felt I wasn't there. That is, all I had to do was finish the filming and go home. Later in the Lebanon war, Ami felt that he was on a tourist tour, observing pretty villages, mountains, women. But at some point, the fantasy of being on a tourist tour or in a movie broke down. This happened when Ami witnessed massive destruction in the Lebanon war and was involved in heavy face-to-face fighting. The last straw was a particularly horrific scene in Beirut of stables piled with corpses of Arabian racehorses mingled with corpses of people. This scene filled Ami with a sense of apocalyptic destruction, and he totally collapsed. He says, in the Yom Kippur War, I put my defense mechanism into operation and it worked fantastically. I was able to push a button and start it up. In Lebanon, the picture was clearer. In the Yom Kippur War, we didn't fight face to face or shoot from a short distance. If I saw a corpse, it was a corpse in the field. But here in Lebanon, everything was right next to me. And of all things, the thing with horses broke me. A pile of corpses, and you see them along with people who were killed. And that's a picture I have never seen in any movie. I began to sense the reality that it is not a movie anymore. Now, anxiety emerges when at the place of the leg, one encounters a certain object which perturbs the fantasy frame through which the subject assessed reality. For the soldier Ami, this happened when he saw the pile of dead horses. If Ami was able to observe dead soldiers in the field to the distance of a fantasy frame which made him believe that he's an outsider just watching a movie, the emergence of the unexpected object, the horses, caused this fantasy to collapse, which also incited Ami's breakdown. With fantasy, the subject creates for him or her a protective shield towards the leg, while in anxiety, the object which emerges at the place of the leg devours the subject. That's to say, it makes the subject to fade. Anxiety is first the response to the most original danger, Hilflosigkeit, to the absolute distress of the subjects entering the world. But subsequently, it is taken up by the ego as a signal of the slightest danger from the threats from the side of the it. The fading of the subject can thus be understood as the collapse of the ego, as the collapse of subject's self-perception. Anxiety is also in a specific way linked to the desire of the other. And anxiety-provoking is the fact that the desire of the other does not recognize me. But even if I have the impression that the other does recognize me, it will never recognize me sufficiently. The other always puts me into question, interrogates me at the very root of my being. Now, in the cases of the breakdown in war, one observes that the soldiers have particular problems also with the desire of the other. Now, here the other in the meaning, let's say, mostly kind of, let's say, individual others or the group. Now, psychiatrists have, for decades, in a way, very much took into account that the soldiers' breakdowns are often triggered by the change in the relationship or in the pattern of the soldier-group relationship. Now, in the traditional war, it was the group that provided, in a way, some kind of a stability for the subject. And psychiatrists, for example, often also claimed that the individual soldiers were incited to fight not out of hatred for the enemy so much as for, they did not want to, in a way, lose respect of their fellow soldiers. And they wanted, in a way, to contribute to the success of the group. Now, studies in military psychiatry also show that soldiers, who experience total collapse or breakdown are best to be treated near the front, and the soldiers who are sent, home suffer longer from their from, let's say, their traumas. But if military psychiatry in the past still considered group relationships as the most important for the soldiers' endurance in war situations, at the time of World War II and later, especially after Vietnam and Korean War, military more and more embraced the idea of individualism, so that a particular soldier became, in a way, a replaceable member of the group. That's why he was able to be, placed in a group for a short time, then, sent back, placed in another group, and so on. Now, after these wars, all kinds of new vocabulary emerged in psychiatry, which tries to, deal with these new types of traumas, which are, in a way, related to this new individualization in the army. And military is therefore speaking about short-termers syndromes, rotation anxiety, and all kinds of similar things, especially after Vietnam War, when these breakdowns were especially common. Now, similar problems, however, with breakdowns we encounter today after and the time also of the wars in the Balkan. Now, especially nowadays, peacekeepers are supposed to, who served in Bosnia and now in Kosovo, are supposed to suffer from many of the breakdowns. Canadian media especially reported that their soldiers who acted as peacekeepers in Bosnia suffered numerous attacks of anxiety and depression after they returned from the front. Wendy Holden points out that peacekeepers suffer from the fact that they must observe atrocities but are helpless to fight back or to defend properly those that they have been sent to save. Proud to be professional soldiers and keen to fight, they are, as she says, distanced from death and the reality of killing. They are members of society that finds fatalities unimaginable. When presented with the unimaginable, they crack. British peacekeeper Gary Bohanna, for example, came to Bosnia with the belief that a peacekeeping role is supposed to be good, better than war in which colleagues get killed. But he quickly became disillusioned when he saw numerous civilians killed, women being raped, whole families slaughtered. For him, the most traumatic event which precipitated his breakdown was when he saw a young girl who, as he depicts, had shrapnel wounds in her head, half her head was blown away, her eyes were coming out of its socket, and she was screaming. She was going to die, but I couldn't bear the pain. I put a blanket over her head and shot her in her head. That was all I could do. Here again, we find a case of the soldier who comes to the war with the protective shield of a fantasy. This time it is a fantasy that he's actually coming to do good deeds and is not fully entering the war. However, the fantasy quickly collapses when an event happens which undermines the story he was telling to himself beforehand. Now, if in the past wars there was still minimal engagement of the soldiers with the victims on the front, in the recent wars, the soldiers are often, in a way, just distant actors who shoot from afar and do not know what happens on the actual front. Contemporary wars are supposed to be aseptic, so that American soldiers might fly for a couple of hours to drop bombs over Kosovo and then return home to watch a soccer game on the TV. For those soldiers who will still need to engage in direct fighting, military psychiatry is trying to invent special medication which might be able to alleviate any possible anxiety. The soldiers will thus be almost robot-like creatures who will not be emotionally engaged in the atrocities they are committing. One theory why it is necessary to invent such drugs is that the war has become too horrible for the human mind and body to realistically tolerate. Military psychiatry, therefore, has an expectation that in the new type of war, anxiety will be just too overwhelming and paralyzing. That is why they try to find chemical substance which will alleviate it. Now, so far, all the attempts to create such drugs have failed. the anti-anxiety drugs used on the front not only did not alleviate anxiety, they produced numerous side effects, which made soldiers zombie-like creatures who are barely able to function and perform war duties. Now, this trend to make wars anxiety-free paradoxically goes hand in hand with today's attempt to make also wars independent from political struggle. In the way the West assessed the whole situation in the former Yugoslavia, we can see how political dimension of the conflicts were constantly overlooked or too quickly historicized. Now, the problem with the intervention that the NATO made in the last years in the former Yugoslavia is that they were publicly presented as simple humanitarian missions, which try to have nothing to do with the political situation in the Balkans, and which also did not admit a strong economic interest that the West has in the region. This ideology of humanitarianism goes hand in hand with the way the war has been also presented in the media. Now, on the one hand, in the media, we get pictures of the intervention which looks like a simple computer game in which soldiers dropping the bombs from the air are completely detached from the suffering victims. But on the other hand, we get images of the suffering victims of the war in which we can see the most horrible distortions of villages, numerous people killed, wounded, and dead bodies exposed on the screen. Today, it thus appears as if in the war everything can be visible of the way how the victims suffer on the ground, while the very machinery of the Western intervention into the conflict looks like a distant computer game. This overvisibility on the one hand and complete invisibility on the other are very much linked to the fact that economic and political logic of the war remain more and more unraveled. Now, hand in hand with these trends in today's wars go the before mentioned attempts of the military psychiatry to alleviate the feeling of anxiety that soldiers might have who are involved with killing and massacres. So the soldier will be completely detached from the situation, outsider, not really present in the war, and will be able to just neutrally observe the atrocities. Now, what kind of society will this be in which the subjects are supposed to suffer no anxiety anymore when they are observing destructions on the front or when they are engaged in violence? Paradoxically, some trends in today's arts can give us a clue about the changes in contemporary society which give ground to the vision of anxiety-free future society. In the last decades, the power of the curator has enormously increased in today's art world. Thus, a curator today acts as an intermediary between the artists and the publics in such a way that he or she not only tells the audience what is art and what is not, but also takes on the role of the one who in some way enjoys in the place of the audience. Austrian philosopher Robert Thaler has invented the term interpassivity to discern the states in which the subject deposits enjoyment into an intermediary who enjoys in the place of the subject. An example would be a man who constantly records films but never watches them because the recorder was also intermediary who had enjoyed the film instead of him. And in contemporary art, a curator is often such an intermediary into whom the audience deposits enjoyment of the art. When I enter an art show in which I'm not really sure what is supposed to be the artistic value of the works displayed, I presuppose that the curator saw something in the objects which makes them art in his eyes. I therefore take curator as someone who enjoys art in my place. Going around gallery, I can continue thinking about my lousy job or my personal dilemmas, while the curator was the one who actually watched the art for me. Curators today look similar to the CNN journalists, who are also, in a way, kind of present as intermediaries who are exposing images of violence in front of our eyes and giving quick theories in the war. It is almost as if the reporters are watching the war instead of the public. The latter can go on, with their everyday life, while the TV deals with the suffering in their place. However, curators have also taken on another role of intermediary. They more and more became successful businessmen who know how to market art and how to sell it. In the recent internet debate on the question of what should curators do at the time of the war, a German art critic wisely suggested that businessmen usually feel unimportant in war times, since decisions on war and peace are left to the generals and politicians. This critic was surprised. Why would manager curators again want to go beyond art and would want to convert themselves into statesmen's curators? That's to say, persons who are controlling the political framework of our civilization. The critic concluded with the question, if it is not time that we have normal, average, even banal curators, since artists have already discovered the strategies of banality, one wonders when will curators discover them? Now, I would claim that this step towards banality has already been made. However, here again, the logic of capital was involved. If we look at the contemporary art scene, we can say that it very much tries to depict banality of the daily life. It looks as if Foucault's thesis from the last volumes on the theory of sexuality, that one needs to make out of oneself a work of art, is taken utterly serious in today's art world. In the 60s, this trend of making out of everyday life an art object has already been in vogue. However, the difference between today's art and the 60s art is that the latter tried to make a political gesture by tearing down the walls of the gallery, while today's art often gave up on the notion of the political. The return to one's own body or making out of oneself, out of one's life, a work of art, is perceived as a gesture which says that there is no point in involving oneself in political debates and so on, since the only power that we can have is over ourselves. Now, this apolitical turn in the arts is very much linked to the logic of today's capitalism. With the globalization of the capital, it becomes less and less possible for the national political powers to exert control over the capital. Paradoxically, it is also the capital that in a way marks the trend in today's obsession with everyday life in art. The ideology of the turn towards oneself is deeply ideologically connected to the logic of today's society. Now, one should never forget that Foucault's call to make out of oneself a work of art paradoxically goes hand in hand with the consumerist ideology, which constantly demands of us to change our appearance and which also makes us realize that there is no point in caring about politics, since in the end we can only change oneself and have very little influence on the society at large. However, my point about the connection between the logic of the capital and the trends in art have also a more banal take. Now, you probably all are more than familiar with the new British art, but for me the interesting information was presented in the book by Julian Stalabras, that the new British art actually paradoxically coincides with kind of economic crisis that Charles Saatchi experienced at the end of the 80s. So Stalabras's point is that at the end of the 80s, Charles Saatchi was facing some economic troubles, which forced him to sell the American art collection, which he was having collected by then, and he started, for very cheap money, buying new British art, and of course with the help of media hype, also with the economic trends that in a way changed the logic of the Turner Prize, the hype of the new British art was born. Now, if on the one hand, art very much tries to show everyday life as art object, on the other hand, art also constantly today tries to depict behind the things, the inside of the body. It looks as if everything can be exposed and that there is nothing to surprise us as what is supposed to be behind the mask. As in the case of war, we can see all kinds of suffering exposed on the screen, bodies being torn in front of our eyes, people killing each other and even recording themselves with video camera. In the arts, we have similar trend. It seems as if every violence over the body can be presented today as an artwork. Now, these trends have been, as you know, predominant in the sensation show, and I'm sure that you are all tired of them. So, just to remind you about the historical importance of, the insides of the body. Here is Mona Khatum's, video of the intestines. And, now I want to show that the new kind of more real art, which is the use of real dead bodies in the show which is recently going on in Köln in Germany, and it's entitled The Word of the Body. This is work of the anatomist Gunther von Hagens, who uses real dead bodies, and through a special process of plastification, he then exposes, let's say, the inside. So you can see basically all body parts exposed, and kind of a Damien Hirst of a real human body is one of the favorite pieces in the art show. Oh, sorry, this is the next thing, which is, another obsession in Tonem's art, which interests me is as a phenomenon, is also, the depiction of real dead bodies. Parvin already gave you a number of images of Wittgen's art. However, here are images of dead fetuses who are, decorated with jewelry, and this is artwork of an Ukrainian artist called Ilya Chichkin, who uses fetuses who died. This is still the previous one. Fetuses who died because of the damages after the Chernobyl. Now, this is one of the pictures with the skin of the real body, and this is also a fetus. Okay, then still another trend is to use real dead body and make chocolates out of, scars. Scars are in a way molded, kind of chocolates are molded on the scars of the dead bodies in the artwork of, I think his name is Stephen Shanabrook, who also, kind of tried to depict differences between eyes of dead people in Russia and in America, making different eyeballs as kind of chocolates. And his idea is basically that one has a desire for chocolate when one smells these art objects. However, one is horrified knowing that they were molded on the parts of a dead body. Now, still, other, of course, trend is to go really inside the body, and this is artwork of Stelarc, who is putting a kind of a sculpture into his stomach, and then taking an X-ray of it. And the next artwork is again of Stelarc, giving us a picture of his intestines. Now, in contemporary society as such, it looks as if there is no social antagonism anymore, as if there is, in a way, no lack. Everything looks visible. There seems to be also no secret. However, this exposure of the inside and the revelation of the everyday life is nothing subversive. It goes, as I said, hand in hand with the dominant ideology. Now, we can find numerous examples, more examples of this exposure of there is no secret. In architecture, I think that especially the insides of restaurants are significant here. Not only that we see nowadays all, the pipes exposed, that's already kind of, I would say, old-fashioned, but the working process is completely exposed. However, when you observe, cooks preparing meal for you in the restaurant, you do not preserve them as low-paid workers, but in a way as decorative art objects. And one does not usually think how hard it must be for these people to be exposed like in a zoo. Now, still other examples of this exposure of the secrets one can find in today's election campaigns. Politicians in their TV advertisements usually do not show anymore the final product, like a speech or a message that the politician wants to give to the public, but one usually sees a politician who shaves himself in the morning, sips a coffee, someone else is writing his speech, he's only kind of going over the speech. So in a way, the message is, I show you everything. There is nothing behind. There is, in a way, no secret. I'm a totally honest man. What you see, in a way, is what you get. Now, the exposure of the secret, however, does not alleviate the anxiety that there is actually someone else pulling the strings behind the guy who is showing the whole truth. Conspiracy theory is very much alive in today's politics. all kinds of, in a way, politicians themselves are kind of playing on this conspiracy theory that they are not really themselves running the show, that behind them, are kind of other powers, they are powerless, and so on. Now, let me finish by returning to the problem of fantasy and anxiety. My point was to show how fantasy and anxiety present two different ways for the subject to deal with the lack that marks him or herself, as well as the other, that's to say the symbolic order. With the help of the fantasy, the subject creates a story which gives his or her life a perception of consistency and stability, while he or she also perceives the social order as being coherent and not marked by antagonisms. If fantasy provides a certain comfort for the subject, anxiety incites the feeling of uncomfortableness. However, anxiety does not simply have a paralyzing effect. The power of anxiety is that it creates a state of preparedness so that the subject might be less paralyzed and surprised by the events that might radically shatter his or her fantasy and thus cause the subject's breakdown or an emergence of trauma. In today's society, we have an attempt to create a situation in which, on the one hand, the subject's anxiety will be possibly eliminated, for example, with the help of drugs that military is trying to invent, and on the other hand, to make everything visible so that there will be nothing to be anxious about anymore. However, this impression that everything is visible, that there is no secret, goes hand in hand with the fact that global capital very much runs the show in today's society without allowing politics to have any influence on the major developments in the world. While ideology presents how everything is visible, people are nonetheless constantly left with the impression that someone else is running the show behind their backs, or that there are hidden enemies who have to be exposed or eliminated. Now, similarly, the problem with the military's attempt to find drugs that would alleviate anxiety on the battlefront is that such drugs, instead of preventing the soldiers' anxieties, actually help to incite new ones. While it is unclear how much military has actually tested drugs on the battlefield, for example, at the time of the Persian War, there was lots of talk about it, the soldiers have indulged in numerous conspiracy theories. A whole set of anxieties emerged in regard to the scientists who are supposedly testing dangerous drugs on the soldiers, and in regard to the paralyzing side effects that these drugs have. So the ultimate trauma for the soldiers became to fight the hidden enemy among those who have sent them to the war in the first place. Now, today it looks as if the world is, in a way, a simulacrum, and a lot of people have, mentioned this word, that everything is, in a way, changeable, life looks like a computer game, and so on. We have, therefore, a kind of perception that everything is also predictable, controllable, and that we are only in need of proper genetic code or drugs to fix things. However, this does not alleviate the fact that the subject is still marked by the unsymbolizable real, which very much undermines his or her self-perception. Now, maybe the perception that in today's world is nothing so different because of the advances in modern technology is the ultimate, maybe in today's world, the idea that something is, in a way, so much different than in the previous world is, in a way, a fantasy in which we very much indulge ourselves, and which also, in a way, protects us first from the fact that the subject is still very much marked by a lack, and that the social is still crossed by antagonisms, and second, that anxiety is still fully operative, although we claim that one can, in a way, predict or prevent or, in a way, fully describe the uncanny object which emerges at the place of the lack. But even if we might agree that science more and more masters death, for example, with all kinds of genetic engineering and so on, we should not forget the famous Kierkegaard saying that what is more horrible than death itself is the possibility of immortality. Thank you.
perhaps while people are thinking, I might ask one, which is really a question about those representations that you showed which used kind of dead bodies. Now, when I ask a question about it, I don't want to be asking about the relationship between the law and the representation, but as it were, the status, the legal status of the act of making the work of art. Because as I understand the law in England, it would be a criminal offence to in any way use a dead body in that way. That is to say, the law prescribes the kind of forms of respect which are due to the dead body. I think there's been kind of some confusion over the state of fetus. And in a way, that law is designed as much to control what happens in a hospital as it does to control what happens in an artist's studio. From the point of view of both, it is to install through the criminal law a certain type of respect for the dead body. I must say I would be fully committed to the maintenance of such kind of sanctions. So what is one to say about the work which has in some sense in its construction has violated those norms, even if, as it were, they're done in third world jurisdictions which somehow can't afford to have or enforce those norms?
Okay, Germany would probably not want to call itself a third world jurisdiction, you know, since this show, the World of the Body, has been, you know, so far one of the most popular shows in Germany. In Mannheim, they had 700,000 visitors, and in Köln, they expect 1 million visitors for this show. You know, people are literally queuing for this, not for the Dome in London, but, you know, for this. Now, maybe that can, you know, keep the Dome alive. Now, yeah, what you mentioned about the British law, it's really interesting, and I asked my friends here in London who are, you know, specializing in the law and the body and so on, and, you know, it is fascinating that, you know, one does not own one's own body in the British jurisdiction. However, lawyers claim that the law can be read also in such a way that if, you know, a dead body has been altered in a particular way which contributes to, let's say, something, and the usual perception is contributes to the scientific, you know, development. In this case, you know, dead body can be used for, you know, whatever purposes. So mostly it was articulated as if a portion of a dead body helps the science, you know, to advance, then, you know, you can use the dead body. Now, artists might also claim that art also, you know, alters. The dead body, in a way, has to be altered for a new purpose in order to be used. I don't know if British legislation would, you know, allow this kind of reading in case of art, but I expect that some of the artists might claim.
You know, the exemptions have to go through a kind of very tightly controlled system. You can't, as it were, claim exemption from the law simply because you happen to be carrying out scientific experiments on people's bodies and needs them. You're drawing them. And I mean, what about the ownership of one's body? I mean, first of all, in a sense, ultimately that should be not the owner of your own body is paradoxically, it seems to me, a consequence of the abolition of slavery. If you were in a position both to own and therefore to sell your body, you would automatically have recreated slavery. In some sense, one needs to realize that actually that the abolition of slavery is also a kind of a constraint against you treating your own body as a commodity in totality. Now, obviously, that also then at the margins and has recently linked to complex legal kind of cases about the extent to which you can or cannot give legal consent to someone to do something to your body which may kind of damage you. And the law holds that, in a sense, you are yourself not the arbiter over that question.
No, but if I understand correctly, British law also have the problem with masochism, that in a way, you know, you can't even torture yourself freely. That's why you maybe go to the third world to do that. Or Germany.
I think actually somehow the idea of Ukrainian art practice.
Yeah, I wanted to try and sort of make some of the connections with architecture, or suggest a possible connection with architecture. I mean, one way to read the artworks is almost to sort of see them as some sort of cult of the sublime, because they were gruesome in a way. And one could possibly say that in this sort of, to use the term from Mark Auger, a fictionalized world, where everything has become distant, so it becomes a bit like a video game, but there has almost been a consequent lust for the sublime that manifests itself in these sort of artworks. And I'm just trying to think through, well, if that were the case, you could sort of construct an argument maybe in terms of an architectural analogy, rather than thinking in terms of like exposure of something, to actually look at the way exposure of workers in a restaurant or whatever, to look at the way that the interest in the sublime has manifested itself. And I guess the way in which a power station, an industrial power station, has been turned into an art gallery could be one precise manifestation of that. Another manifestation possibly could be the lust for size. I mean, Rem was talking about this lust for sublimely huge buildings going on. Well, they're just suggestions.
Okay, I think I agree with you about that sublime, and which means that it's beautiful and horrible at the same time. And as far as state goes, I like it, but I must say that my 8-month-old son absolutely hated it. He started crying immediately when he entered the building, although he's very tolerant with museums, and especially likes Saatchi's gallery with the big babies. However, what you said about buildings reminded me of Ceausescu's famous palace, which happily we visited because you organized a conference there. And I remember, the leaflet which we got, the visitors of this, monstrous building, said that although, it's such a horrible, in a way, kind of traumatic building, it nonetheless is made only out of Romanian material, and it has been produced through enormous suffering of the people. And that's why, today's Romanians are in a way cherishing it, blah, 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 did not decide to ruin it, and so on. And for me, the interesting part was also the suffering, although many people died and so on, the whole country almost collapsed, the idea is because of this, suffering, it's almost like a dead body one can observe with some kind of pleasure, How does this relate to my talk?
I'd just like to hear some more comments on the end of your talk, where you were suggesting that although everything is becoming visible, that maybe the desire to see everything is not really satisfied. So it's not because everything has become visible that you really can see everything, or that you have, maybe if you see everything, then your next feeling is that in fact there is nothing to see. Something like this.
Absolutely, no, I agree with you, and I think that precisely if you look at the cases of how art through history dealt with female genitals, you can see, okay, first you have the images of Medusa, that kind of horror-like creatures. Then you have, all kinds of images with genitals being covered by fig leaves and so on. And then, of course, you have the famous Courbet picture, of kind of the real thing, which, by the way, as probably you all know, was owned by Jacques Lacan. Now, the interesting part of the story is that Lacan's wife asked someone to make a special curtain. So, in Lacan's house, they covered the picture with a special curtain, and Lacan's wife asked the person who was making the curtain that the curtain should have some kind of stylization of the woods. So So you have, kind of sterilization of the woods covering, the kind of pattern of the woods covering this picture of, what's supposed to be the real thing. Now, of course, the next step, if this is still in a way kind of modernism, in a way, I would say that today the turn is, of course, to see what is inside. And the Slovenian artist, a friend of mine, had done this, which means he made a huge performance, the most visited performance in Slovenia probably in the last decade, which was called Search for the G-Spot. And so the guy went into vagina and, with a micro camera, looked at what is in there and where the G-spot is supposed to be located. Now, of course, one can see what, at the end, what sees is precisely what is, in a way, the picture of the intestines. It's kind of, some kind of a pinkish skin. Now, the horrible part of this performance was, however, at the end, because, after, one could see that there is nothing, in a way, to see, the guy forgot the machinery in the woman who was the art object, So basically, she had been there, in pain on the table, having all the stuff injected in her, in a way, and the artist was carrying on his theory of what is the G-spot and so on, Now, I think that the kind of, my point was in a way that, art somehow today tries to show precisely how there is, in a way, this nothing. But however, I would not say that, in a way, art is touching, in this case, somehow the real. My idea is that art is still much more, in a way, playing with the simulacras. However, the impression one gets is that there is nothing one can be horrified anymore. That the thing itself, which kind of Lacanian thing, the horror cannot, really emerge because we already have seen everything, and everything, can be, in a way, observed to the point of, the inside of the vagina, which does not mean, in a way, that there are less, in a way, horrors or anxieties that haunt the subjects, also in regard to what is inside of the women's bodies.
Okay, this must be the last
I just come with a question concerning when you just say that art doesn't deal with the real and that does deal with simulacra, and I think that in a way you also demonstrated that art does with the real and with the real space and creates in a way spatial dynamics as the were, and this was quite a strong point when you speak about the front and how the soldier which have had problems of trauma and anxiety could be closer or has to take a distance of the front. I think that the question with space is an interesting question, and I think that you, in a way, you addressed it also through the artworks that you show when you say, for example, that the exhibition in Germany attracted 1 million people. It generated spatial dynamics exactly as a building. And I think that this is maybe an interesting question, how trauma, how anxiety generates spatial dynamics. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that what you ask is what is the missing part of my presentation, since I know that we are at the conference on psychoanalysis and space. I think that you added this missing point. I would say, yes, that there is definitely, something in regard to the spatial dimension to it, and I also, think that there is a lot that can be said about it, the new kind of, let's say, space without the space emerging in the virtual world, which is, again, an issue that I think opens in a new way the whole issue of anxiety for the subject. Not only that, we kind of have this horror of what is out there, but also this out there in a way opening new spaces. And one of these spaces for me, when I did research for this article, was quite a shocking space called torture.com, where I hope, you will not now suddenly go to look at it, but like, everything that is inside, the body can be absolutely seen there in reality, which means that, all kinds of victims of crash, car accidents, wars, anatomy done, kind of hidden at almost like home table and so on, is exposed to the public in this virtual space, and there is a competition going on of the rating, which images are like the most gruesome. So I think that that's probably the theme for another paper.
I think on that.